Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and salam sejahtera. My name is Najah Inani Abdul Jalil, and together with Professor Dr. Maidin, we would like to present our paper on rent control advantages and disadvantages. The paper is prompted due to the proposed introduction of Residential Tenancy Act (RTA), which has sparked concern on the issue of rent control. There are strong opposition for the application of rent control, regardless of its form. Okay, regardless of form of control that will be implemented with the introduction of the RTA. So the concern for the landlord is on the economic return from the rental activities and the freedom to determine when and how the rent should be fixed or renewed. In terms of the economic return, it means the rental that monthly received by the landlord. And concern for the tenant is on the issue of security of tenure that should be protected during the tenancy to ensure the safety and the security of the family members. So for the introduction, with the advance of time and the rising of housing costs, a well-designed rent regulation may be welcome, especially among younger generation. Although we are providing the home ownership to all, but let's not forget about the generation which require rental to house their families. So for the rent control in Malaysia, the first legislation related to rent control in Malaysia was passed during the Second World War, entitled Rent and Charge Land Restriction Enactment number 14 of 1940. It commensurate to the time of crisis and war, but will merely provide for temporal control during the time of emergency. Later on, in 1967, on 1st January, Rent Control Act 1966 Act 56 was enforced to control and to regulate rent of building built before 31st January 1948 within a local authority area. This is to protect the right to occupy by the tenant and their family of this building. So rent control operate in RAM as it imposes the control on the premises and not in personam to the tenant. So whoever occupy the premises, he will be entitled to the protection of the act. That means the rent should not be increased based on the rental premises. So for the methodology, this research adopt doctrinal approach which involve analysis on the rent control in Malaysia, type of rent control and the effect of rent control. So the primary sources such as legislation, regulation, rules are used to obtain the primary information. For other relevant information, reference is made to secondary sources such as textbook, journal and other periodical. So data was analyzed by using content and critical analysis method to determine on whether rent control is an effective tool to provide affordable rental housing to public. So for the debate of rent control refers to the restriction imposed by the government on the amount that the landlord can charge the tenant for the purpose of accommodation. So under this scheme, rent increase are not allowed. So the good is the provision, the advantages would be the provision of the affordable rental housing to some tenant. However, the disadvantage would be the reducing investment in the construction for new housing stock in the private rental sector and maintenance of the existing rental housing stock. Okay, so we have three types of rent control: first generation, second generation and third generation. For the first generation, it applied during the war. However, however uh, it has been it linger on for certain period of time. And then for the second generation, rent to be increased annually with automatic percentage. Okay, or it will be increased due to the external factors. So in this situation, for the initial rent, it will be determined by the market value. However, as the time goes by, so the rent will be set higher, and as the time goes by, it will decline as the tenancy period continue. So the landlord would choose a short-term tenant, so rent could be set higher again. For the third generation, rent control during the tenancy, but it is decontrolled between the tenancy. Okay, so the rent could be set higher again for the new tenancy, but during the tenancy, the rent should not be increased. So the effect of rent control, the advantages would be provision of affordable housing to tenants, preservation of the community as they will stay longer to enjoy the reduced rent, and prevent displacement and homelessness among the tenants. For the disadvantages, however, it will create a shortage of affordable rental property because it will demotivate the landlord from offering their property for rental because the rent cannot be increased, and the rent also is controlled. And then the second one, quality and extent of disrepair. So in this situation, as the amount of rent is reduced or being controlled, then the landlord would not have the motivation to preserve the quality or to do the repair on the property because they are receiving less money from the rental. So for the discussion, with the proposed introduction of RTA, a comprehensive statutory provision should be introduced not only on the rent, but also on whether the rent stipulated by the landlord is fair for the tenant, taking into consideration the market value of the rental property and the availability of any services, amenities, and facilities to the rental premise. The law must be in place to determine the period of tenancy between the parties, whether any increase of rent is allowed during the continuance of the tenancy, and how to initiate the increment process, and what is the avenue for tenant if the increase is not mutually agreed with. Although we agree that the rent should be based on the willing landlord, willing tenant concept, some form of control must be in existence to regulate the relationship between the two. So, as for the conclusion, rental regulation must be advocated together with other measure to protect both landlord and also tenant. Rent control will benefit the occupant who live in the control unit, but it increases the rent outside the control unit. As the tenant pay less, the landlord will provide less as well. So instead of limiting the rental income for the landlord, the law should be introduced to balance the right and obligation between the parties. It is suggested for the termination and increase of rent should be prohibited during the continuancy of the tenancy unless it is approved in accordance with the law. With that, thank you.